Today, we're dusting off some treasured memories, those little snapshots of daily life that feel both familiar and somehow distant now. Grab a seat, settle in, and let your mind wander back in time. You might recognize a few things from your past that spark a smile or a laugh, reminding us all of how much our lives and tastes have changed over the years. Number 1. Sliced hot dogs with baked beans. In the mid-20th century, especially during the 1950s and 1960s, many American families turned to budget-friendly dishes that could be stretched to feed a crowd of hungry kids at lunchtime. Sliced hot dogs mixed with canned baked beans became one such staple, appearing regularly on the table for baby boomers growing up in suburban neighborhoods. Hot dogs, once celebrated for their convenience and affordability, joined forces with thick, molasses-sweetened beans to create a hearty midday meal that kept children satisfied for hours. Post-war advertisements often featured smiling families gathered around the dinner or lunch table, ladling steamy beans and plump slices of hot dog onto plates as a symbol of abundance and modern efficiency. Though this dish was never hailed as gourmet fare, its popularity soared because it required minimal preparation, a single pot on the stove, and less than 15 minutes of cook time. Parents in the 1970s carried on the tradition, using the same brands of canned beans their own mothers had purchased in the 1940s, sometimes tossing in a drizzle of ketchup or mustard for an extra kick. However, by the 1980s, changing health norms and increased scrutiny of preservatives led younger Gen X households to reduce their reliance on processed meats. As more fresh proteins and international flavors found their way into American supermarkets, the old Franks and beans combination slipped from the rotating lunch roster. Today, while you can still find all the ingredients in grocery aisles, the practice of boiling hot dogs, slicing them up and mixing them into canned baked beans for a daily lunch has mostly faded. The simplicity that once earned it a permanent spot on the table is overshadowed by a new wave of quick, trendy, and more globally inspired meals that better appeal to modern tastes. Number 2. Creamed chicken on biscuits. During the 1930s and 1940s, creamed chicken served over biscuits emerged as a lunch mainstay in regions where hearty, comforting dishes were beloved for both their richness and affordability. Tapping into an era when people were trying to make the most of every leftover, cooks often took small amounts of chicken, combined it with a roux-based cream sauce, and spread the mixture over freshly baked biscuits. The baby boomer generation that followed grew up recognizing this meal as a satisfying midday indulgence, especially in areas of the country that favored home-style cooking with a Southern twist. Vintage cookbooks from the 1950s displayed glamorous photos of fluffy biscuits drenched in velvety sauce, dotted with peas or diced carrots for bursts of color. By the 1960s, as more Americans migrated to the suburbs, biscuits in a can and packaged chicken gravy mixes became popular shortcuts, appearing in old commercials that touted convenience as the future of cooking. However, the meal's heavy reliance on butter, cream, and refined flour eventually clashed with the emerging health-conscious attitudes of the 1970s and 1980s. Gen X parents, influenced by new research on fat content and cholesterol, gradually opted for lighter lunches. Microwave-ready dishes became fashionable, reducing the time and effort spent making dough from scratch. The rise of global cuisine trends also brought stir-fries, salads, and pasta dishes to the forefront of American mealtimes. Although creamed chicken on biscuits remains a nostalgic entry in certain family recipe boxes, it's rarely seen on the lunch menu in an era where fresh vegetables, lean proteins, and more adventurous culinary influences hold sway. Many younger adults have never tasted it outside of heritage-themed diners or potluck gatherings that celebrate mid-century cooking. Number 3. Tuna noodle casserole. From the 1950s onward, tuna noodle casserole found a place in countless American households, often served at lunchtime to stretch ingredients and feed families for more than one sitting. Post-war prosperity meant that canned goods became more widely available. So homemakers turned to shelf-stable items like condensed cream of mushroom soup, canned tuna, and egg noodles to form the basis of this budget-friendly dish. Baby boomers remember the distinct savory aroma filling the kitchen, the mild, fishy smell of tuna, blending with the creamy soup and mild onion or celery flavorings. In old commercials, black and white images showcased mothers proudly unveiling their casseroles, topped with crumbled potato chips, breadcrumbs, or even cornflakes cereal for an added crunchy layer. By the 1960s and 1970s, families relied on these casseroles for quick lunches, where a single large baking dish could easily be reheated. However, shifting attitudes about sodium content, processed ingredients, and the heavy use of condensed soups began to take hold in the late 1970s. The rise of fast casual restaurants and global cuisines during the 1980s offered new lunchtime alternatives that felt fresher and more varied. Gen X often found the dish old-fashioned, especially as they grew up sampling stir-fries, tacos, and other international fare that required fewer canned products. Additionally, as fish consumption diversified to include tuna steaks, salmon fillets, and more modern preparations, the once reliable casserole lost its appeal. Fewer households made it a routine lunch, and many younger cooks found it outdated compared to lighter meals or straightforward pasta dishes. Though tuna noodle casserole occasionally resurfaces in retro-themed cookbooks or nostalgia-based potlucks, it no longer dominates the midday hour like it once did. Number 4. Canned meatball stew with white rice. Long before slow cookers and instant meal kits gained popularity, American families of the 1950s and 1960s gravitated toward canned convenience foods. One often overlooked lunch involved popping open a can of pre-seasoned meatball stew, sometimes with carrots and potatoes included, warming it in a saucepan and ladling it over a bed of freshly cooked white rice. In the post-war era, brands capitalized on the novelty of combining small, processed meatballs in a thick gravy or tomato sauce, touting it as a ready-to-serve, full-flavored solution for the midday slump. Baby boomers might recall how these cans lined their pantries or appeared in ads promoting modern ways to reduce prep time. During the 1970s, such pre-made stews frequently found a place in school cafeterias, heated in large industrial pots and dished out to a generation of children used to the taste of shelf-stable lunch items. By the 1980s, however, the rise of national fast food chains with budget-friendly menus offered an alternative, quickly overshadowing the idea of home-heated meatball stew. Gen X households, increasingly focused on clarity around ingredients, discovered the high sodium and questionable meat sources within these cans didn't align with newer dietary guidelines. The internet age brought with it recipes that encouraged cooks to form their own meatballs using fresh ground beef or turkey, adding a personal spin to stews that felt more wholesome. Over time, the reliance on canned stew for lunch eroded, and the product itself lost visibility in mainstream grocery ads. Though it may still exist in certain aisles as a nostalgic relic, few people rely on it as a go-to midday meal, signaling a marked shift away from one-pot, processed solutions toward more freshly assembled options. Number 5. Macaroni salad with Vienna sausages. Macaroni salads loaded with mayonnaise, diced onions, and small chunks of celery were iconic potluck fare in the 1960s and 1970s. But for many households, they also doubled as a simple lunch dish. Adding Vienna sausages, a compact, shelf-stable protein sold in small cans, turned the salad into a heartier meal. Families strapped for time could boil macaroni in under 10 minutes, chop up a few vegetables, then fold in slices of these sausages for a tangy, savory flavor. Baby boomers remember seeing these macaroni salads at summer picnics, church events, and even in the fridge, ready to be scooped onto plates at noon. The convenience factor was heavily advertised, with old commercials painting a picture of modern living, highlighting how you could store multiple cans of Vienna sausages without worrying about spoilage. By the time the 1980s arrived, concerns over processed meats and the high preservative content in Vienna sausages began to surface. Gen X responded by introducing more fresh proteins into their lunches and swapping mayonnaise-laden salads for vinaigrette-based ones. The lure of global dishes, from pasta tossed in olive oil to vibrant Asian-inspired salads, also pushed mayonnaise-based macaroni salad out of daily rotation. Additionally, the availability of refrigeration in workplaces and schools changed how people approach lunchtime meals. Pre-cut vegetables, grilled chicken strips, and other fresh items were easier to pack and consume. Over time, the fusion of macaroni salad with Vienna sausages, once a quick fix for resourceful parents, slipped toward extinction. Though a few households may still revive it during nostalgic gatherings, the typical midday crowd now seeks lighter fare with bolder, fresher ingredients. Number 6, boiled cabbage with corned beef. Throughout much of the early and mid-20th century, boiled dinners were a thrifty way to feed large families on modest budgets, especially in regions with strong Eastern European or Irish heritage. Boiled cabbage with corned beef, replete with onions, potatoes, and carrots, served as a reliable lunchtime staple in certain communities from the 1930s onward. Cooking these ingredients together in a single pot made the meal cost-effective and relatively simple, requiring minimal oversight once everything had been set to simmer. Baby boomers who grew up in these households remember the pungent aroma of boiling cabbage permeating the kitchen, and sometimes the entire home. The salty corned beef contrasted nicely with the natural sweetness of slow-cooked vegetables, forming a rustic midday plate that satisfied appetites without elaborate preparation. By the 1970s, changing social dynamics and the dawn of convenience foods encouraged more people to experiment with frozen dinners or shortcuts that skipped the hours-long boiling process. Also, as families moved away from traditional enclaves, the cultural tradition of big pot meals for lunch weakened. The 1980s brought heightened awareness of sodium intake, and corned beef, typically cured in brine, lost favor among the growing health-conscious population. Gen X found themselves gravitating to quicker, more flexible lunch options, sometimes influenced by newly popular diet trends that advocated lighter proteins and more fresh vegetables. Over time, the concept of boiling cabbage and corned beef together for midday meals began to feel outdated, relegated mainly to holiday gatherings like St. Patrick's Day. Today, while some gourmet or heritage chefs still champion this style of one-pot cooking, it's generally no longer a fixture in the average American lunch routine. Number 7, frozen chicken pot pie. Starting around the 1950s, chicken pot pies, particularly the frozen versions sold by national brands, embodied the marvel of post-war freezer technology and the promise of effortless meals. Early TV commercials portrayed these pies as an upgrade from scratch cooking, allowing homemakers more leisure time while still serving up a piping hot lunch. Typically, these pies included a flaky crust encasing a creamy chicken and vegetable filling, offering a balance of protein, carbs, and some form of greenery. Baby boomers recall the convenience of these single-serving pies that could be placed in the oven, and later microwaved once such appliances became commonplace for a quick midday fix. The comfort factor was high. The steamy interior and buttery crust felt like home-style cooking without the labor-intensive process. Over time, though, rising concerns about sodium, trans fats, and preservatives chipped away at their reputation. In the 1970s, families began examining the nutritional panels, realizing a pot pie might pack more salt and fat than desired. The 1980s ushered in a wave of lighter eating trends, and more internationally diverse foods captured the public's imagination. Gen X was also juggling an era of increased work outside the home, making truly fast lunches, like fast food or simple sandwiches, more appealing than waiting for a pot pie to heat through in a conventional oven. Microwave versions often turned out soggy crusts, which further diluted their appeal. While chicken pot pies still exist in grocery freezers, the notion of regularly enjoying them at lunch has faded. especially now that most consumers looking for convenience prefer meal prep services, fresh salads, or simple pasta dishes they can assemble quickly. The nostalgic memory of a bubbling chicken pot pie at midday lingers, but it's largely absent from the contemporary lunch menu. Number 8, gelatin mold with canned fruit cocktail. Mid-century America had a deep fascination with gelatin-based concoctions. By the 1950s and 1960s, the idea of setting various fruits, and sometimes vegetables, into vibrantly colored gelatin captured the national imagination, with recipe booklets showcasing elaborately shaped molds. Families often considered these visually striking jiggly dishes suitable for lunch, typically served alongside a protein or as a sweet, savory palate cleanser. Baby boomers grew up associating these wobbly molds with festive gatherings, potlucks, or even casual weekend lunches. Canned fruit cocktail, peaches, pears, grapes, and cherries suspended in syrup, was a convenient go-to, adding color and sweetness without requiring fresh fruit. Advertisements featuring smiling homemakers talked up how easy it was to create a modern meal centerpiece in just a few steps. By the 1970s, however, as fresh produce availability expanded, the novelty of heavily sweetened fruit and gelatin began to wane. Health experts pointed out the excessive sugar, artificial flavors, and dyes, steering consumers toward more natural salads. Additionally, the 1980s saw a boom in global cuisine influences, and people started craving dynamic flavors that deviated from the uniform sweetness of canned fruit and artificially flavored gelatin. Gen X was less enamored by the shapely molds that had fascinated their parents, choosing alternatives like tossed salads, fruit plates, or yogurt-based desserts. Eventually, the 1990s and early 2000s cemented the decline of the gelatin mold as a default midday dish. Though you can still spot retro recipes at special events or nostalgic theme parties, these once popular fruit cocktail molds have mostly vanished from everyday lunches, representing a specific era when convenience, color, and novelty often outweighed nutritional considerations. Number 9. Baked beans with salt pork. A hearty tradition that has roots stretching back to colonial America, baked beans with salt pork became a recognizable midday meal throughout the 20th century, especially in areas like New England. By simmering navy beans slowly with molasses, sugar, mustard, and chunks of salt pork, families created a thick, robust dish that paired well with fresh bread or cornbread. Baby boomers remember sitting down at the lunch table on weekends or special occasions to this sweet, savory classic, which required hours of low-heat cooking in the oven or a crock. Regional cookbooks of the 1930s and 1940s embraced baked beans as a communal dish for church gatherings or extended family dinners, but it also made its way into more informal lunches, particularly if there were leftovers from a larger batch. As the 1950s and 1960s progressed, canned versions simplified the process, allowing parents to quickly heat up the beans on a stove for the midday meal. However, by the 1970s and 1980s, diets shifted yet again toward lighter, faster options. Salt pork, with its high-fat content, didn't align with rising health campaigns that advocated reducing saturated fats. Also, the slow cooking required for authentic baked beans conflicted with modern time constraints. The spread of quick-service restaurants and prepared meals meant families had less incentive to keep traditions like all-day bean baking alive for lunch. Gen X, more exposed to global tastes, found less appeal in the monochromatic sweetness and heaviness of baked beans with salt pork. Today, while you might catch glimpses of this dish at historical reenactments, small-town diners, or holiday gatherings, it rarely features in day-to-day lunches, reflecting a broader cultural move away from multi-hour cooking rituals and fatty pork ingredients. Number 10. Tater tot casserole. Beloved in several regions of the United States throughout the 1960s and 1970s, tater tot casserole was a classic lunch dish for families looking to utilize affordable processed ingredients in creative ways. Typically, a layer of ground beef mixed with cream of something soup and vegetables formed the base, topped by a generous layer of frozen tater tots that baked to a crisp. Baby boomers often encountered this casserole at church socials or potlucks, served piping hot in large baking dishes that easily fed hungry crowds. Old commercials highlighted tater tots as a fun, kid-friendly potato product, which parents happily incorporated into the midday rotation. However, nutritional guidelines that gained prominence in the late 1970s and the 1980s questioned the wisdom of heavily processed foods. Creamed soups, often brimming with sodium, and the deep-fried tater tots themselves drew scrutiny. At the same time, the proliferation of global fast food chains and the emergence of more versatile lunchtime options, like salads, sandwiches, and ethnic-inspired bowls, altered American eating habits. Gen X, partly influenced by an interest in fresh produce and a lower-fat approach, found tater tot casserole to be heavy on calories and light on genuine nutritional value. The labor of assembling it in the morning, waiting for it to bake, and cleaning up also proved prohibitive for modern lifestyles that favored microwaved or reheated meals. Though some nostalgia-driven cooks revive it for themed gatherings, tater tot casserole no longer holds a central spot on lunchtime tables. Its decline reflects shifting values around home cooking and the preference for either truly homemade or genuinely fresh ingredients, rather than reheating prepackaged items in a single casserole dish.